The roar of Merlin engines cut through the cold December morning air over the English Channel in 1944. Lieutenant James Mitchell gripped the control stick of his P-51 Mustang, his breath visible in the freezing cockpit despite his oxygen mask. Below him, the dark waters churned relentlessly, a reminder that survival out here meant staying airborne. The aluminum skin of his fighter reflected the weak winter sun, its polished metal surface gleaming like a predator's tooth. He glanced at his wingman, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, flying tight formation off his right side. They had been airborne for nearly 2 hours, escorting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses deep into German territory. If you appreciate stories like this one, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical narratives. Mitchell adjusted his radio frequency, hearing the crackling static punctuated by brief transmissions from other pilots in the squadron. The mission briefing that morning had been clear. Escort the bombers to their target near Frankfurt, maintain formation discipline, and engage any enemy fighters that threatened the heavies. Intelligence reports suggested minimal Luftwaffe activity in the area, but Mitchell knew better than to trust such assessments. The Germans had proven time and again their ability to appear when least expected. The formation climbed steadily toward 25,000 feet, where contrails began streaming from the wingtips of the bombers ahead. Mitchell scanned the sky continuously, his eyes moving in practiced patterns across the vast expanse of blue and white. The temperature gauge read -40 degrees Celsius. His fingers felt stiff inside his leather gloves, and he flexed them periodically to maintain circulation. The P-51 responded to every subtle input, a machine so finely tuned that it felt like an extension of his own body. Hayes broke radio silence with a calm voice that belied years of combat experience. The static cleared momentarily as he spoke, reporting visual contact with the bomber formation ahead. Mitchell acknowledged with 2 clicks of his microphone button, maintaining radio discipline. They had flown together since training back in Texas, developing an unspoken understanding that had saved both their lives on multiple occasions. Hayes was methodical, careful, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Mitchell trusted him completely. The bomber stream stretched for miles, a seemingly endless procession of 4-engine aircraft laden with explosives. Each B-17 carried 10 men, fathers and sons and brothers, all betting their lives on the ability of fighters like Mitchell to keep the German interceptors away. The weight of that responsibility never left him. He thought about the letters he had written the night before, sealed and left in his footlocker in case he did not return. His mother in Ohio would read about his life here, about the friends he had made and lost, about the exhaustion that seeped into his bones after every mission. The clouds below broke apart, revealing patches of countryside that marked the border between occupied France and Germany. Small villages dotted the landscape, their inhabitants living under the shadow of war. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin vertical columns, dissipating quickly in the wind. Mitchell wondered what those people thought when they heard the thunder of hundreds of aircraft passing overhead. Did they feel hope? Fear? Resignation? A voice crackled over the radio, sharp and urgent. The formation leader had spotted bogies at 2 o'clock high, climbing fast. Mitchell's pulse quickened as he strained his eyes toward the indicated position. There, perhaps 5 miles distant, he caught the glint of sunlight on metal. The bogies were climbing aggressively, their contrails marking steep trajectories toward the bomber formation. He counted at least 8 contacts, possibly more obscured by cloud layers above. Hayes confirmed the sighting, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that must have been coursing through his veins. Mitchell pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Packard-built Merlin engine respond with a surge of power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour as they angled to intercept. The German fighters continued their climb, showing no sign of hesitation or fear. These were experienced pilots, confident in their abilities and their aircraft. As the distance closed, Mitchell identified the enemy planes as Focke-Wulf 190s, formidable adversaries known for their speed and firepower. The German pilots maintained their aggressive posture, clearly intent on breaking through to the bombers. Mitchell felt the familiar combination of fear and focus that preceded combat. His hands steadied on the controls, his breathing slowed, and the world narrowed to the immediate tactical situation. Then something unexpected happened. The lead German aircraft banked sharply, breaking off the intercept. The others followed in rapid succession, their formation dissolving as they turned away from the approaching Mustangs. Mitchell watched in confusion as the Focke-Wulfs dove away, accelerating toward the deck. Hayes expressed similar bewilderment over the radio, questioning whether this was some kind of tactical feint. But the German fighters continued their retreat, disappearing into the cloud layers below without firing a single shot. The bomber formation continued unmolested toward its target. Mitchell and Hayes resumed their positions, scanning continuously for any renewed threat. The strange encounter left Mitchell unsettled. In previous missions, German fighters had proven themselves willing to press home attacks, despite heavy losses. Their sudden withdrawal made no tactical sense, unless they had been ordered to avoid engagement with the Mustangs specifically. After the bombers completed their attack and turned for home, Mitchell's flight landed back at their base in southern England. The debriefing session that evening proved unusual. Multiple flights reported similar experiences. German fighters initiating intercepts only to break off upon identifying P-51s. Intelligence officers took detailed notes, their expressions suggesting this pattern represented something significant. Captain Richard Barnes, the squadron intelligence officer, addressed the assembled pilots in the smoke-filled briefing room. He was a former lawyer from Boston, methodical and precise in his analysis. He explained that ultra-intercepts, the top-secret decryptions of German communications, had revealed standing orders from Luftwaffe High Command. German pilots were explicitly instructed to avoid engagement with P-51 Mustangs whenever possible, instead focusing on other Allied fighter types and unescorted bombers. The room erupted in discussion. Some pilots expressed satisfaction at the enemy's apparent fear of their aircraft. Others questioned the strategic implications. Mitchell sat quietly, processing this information. The order suggested that the Luftwaffe recognized something fundamental about the P-51's capabilities, something that made it a threat worth avoiding rather than confronting. The Mustang's combination of range, speed, maneuverability, and firepower had apparently earned a deadly reputation among German pilots. Hayes leaned over and spoke quietly, suggesting that such orders might be double-edged. While they indicated respect for the Mustang's abilities, they also meant that German pilots would become increasingly desperate when forced into combat, fighting with the ferocity of cornered animals. Mitchell nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his friend's observation. Fear could make an enemy either cautious or reckless, and the latter posed greater danger. The missions continued through the bitter winter of 1944 and into the new year. Each sortie reinforced the pattern identified in earlier encounters. German fighters would shadow the bomber formations, waiting for opportunities to attack when escorts were absent or engaged elsewhere. But when P-51s appeared, the Luftwaffe pilots invariably withdrew, seeking easier prey or declining combat altogether. Mitchell flew through thick weather and clear skies, through flak so dense it seemed impossible to survive, and through peaceful corridors where war felt distant and unreal. He watched friends die in sudden, violent encounters with the few German pilots willing to ignore standing orders. He saw aircraft explode in mid-air, their crews given no chance to bail out. He witnessed parachutes drifting slowly earthward, each one representing a life suspended between sky and ground, between survival and death. The psychological impact of the German withdrawal orders became evident as weeks passed. Allied bomber losses decreased significantly when adequately escorted by Mustangs. The strategic bombing campaign intensified, with thousand-plane raids becoming routine. German industrial capacity suffered devastating blows as factories, rail yards, and fuel production facilities were systematically destroyed. The Luftwaffe's decision to avoid the P-51 had inadvertently contributed to the accelerating collapse of Germany's ability to wage war. In February, Mitchell's squadron relocated to a base in France, operating from a hastily prepared airstrip near the front lines. The accommodations were primitive compared to England: tents instead of Nissen huts, mud instead of concrete, uncertainty instead of routine. But the proximity to the battlefield brought certain advantages. Missions could be flown with greater frequency, and the time over target increased since less fuel was consumed reaching enemy territory. One morning, Mitchell was assigned to fly close air support for ground forces advancing toward the Rhine. The mission represented a departure from his usual role of bomber escort, requiring different tactics and mindset. He studied maps showing friendly positions marked in blue and enemy strongpoints indicated in red. Artillery coordinates were provided for reference, though he understood that the fluid nature of ground combat meant those positions might change rapidly. The flight took off in loose formation, staying low to avoid detection. Mitchell led a section of 4 Mustangs, with Hayes flying as his wingman and 2 newer pilots, Lieutenants Peterson and Rodriguez, completing the flight. They followed river valleys and tree lines, using terrain masking to conceal their approach. The countryside showed extensive battle damage: cratered fields, burned-out vehicles, collapsed bridges, and villages reduced to rubble. Ground control directed them toward a German armored column attempting to reinforce defensive positions. Mitchell descended to 2,000 feet, scanning ahead for the targets. He spotted them emerging from a tree line, a mix of tanks and half-tracks moving along a narrow road. The vehicles were spaced well apart, their crews clearly aware of the danger from air attack. Dark smoke from their exhausts marked their progress across the winter landscape. Mitchell rolled into his attack dive, lining up on the lead tank. His finger hovered over the trigger as the target filled his gun sight. At 1,500 feet, he pressed the firing button, feeling the Mustang shudder as 6 .50-caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Tracers arced downward, converging on the tank in a brilliant display of destructive force. Armor-piercing rounds sparked against steel plating, some penetrating, others ricocheting into the surrounding area. The tank exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast that sent debris flying in all directions. Mitchell pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. Hayes attacked the second vehicle in line, achieving similar results. Peterson and Rodriguez engaged targets further back in the column, their inexperience showing in less precise attacks, but still inflicting damage. German anti-aircraft fire erupted from positions Mitchell had not spotted on his initial pass. Tracers reached up like deadly fingers, probing for his aircraft. He jinked violently, throwing the Mustang into a series of sharp turns designed to spoil the gunner's aim. A shell burst close enough that he felt the concussion through the airframe. Metal fragments peppered his wings, leaving small tears in the aluminum skin. The flight reformed and made additional passes, systematically destroying the German column. By the fourth attack, only burning wrecks remained, black smoke rising in tall columns visible for miles. Ground control confirmed the successful interdiction and released them to return to base. Mitchell checked his fuel state and noted damage to his left wing, but nothing that threatened the aircraft's airworthiness. As they climbed away from the target area, Mitchell noticed a single aircraft in the distance, flying low and fast toward the east. The silhouette was distinctive, a Messerschmitt 109, one of the Luftwaffe's primary fighters. The German pilot was alone, likely separated from his formation or returning from a solo reconnaissance mission. Mitchell faced a decision. His primary mission was complete, but engaging the 109 meant pursuing it away from friendly territory, burning fuel he might need to return home. Hayes observed the distant contact and asked over the radio whether they should pursue. Mitchell considered the tactical situation. His flight was low on ammunition after the ground attack, and two of his pilots were relatively inexperienced in air-to-air combat. But allowing the German fighter to escape meant potentially giving up intelligence about Allied ground positions. He made his decision, ordering Peterson and Rodriguez to return to base while he and Hayes investigated the contact. The two Mustangs accelerated in pursuit, the gap closing steadily. The German pilot maintained his course, apparently unaware of the threat behind him. Mitchell activated his gun sight and checked his remaining ammunition. He had perhaps 20 seconds of firing time left, enough for one good engagement if he made his shots count. The Messerschmitt suddenly broke hard left, pulling into a tight turn that suggested the pilot had finally spotted his pursuers. Mitchell followed, the Mustang's superior power and aerodynamics allowing him to maintain position through the turn. The German pilot was skilled, varying his flight path with unexpected maneuvers designed to deny Mitchell a clean shot. They descended in a deadly spiral, altitude bleeding away as both aircraft pushed their performance limits. Hayes positioned himself higher, ready to intervene if the German pilot gained advantage. Mitchell focused entirely on the 109 ahead, anticipating each move, countering each defensive maneuver. The German tried a chandelle, pulling up sharply and rolling inverted, hoping Mitchell would overshoot. But Mitchell had seen this tactic before and throttled back, maintaining position just outside firing range. Then the Messerschmitt pilot made a critical error. He pulled too tight in a climbing turn, bleeding energy too quickly. His airspeed dropped below sustainable levels, and the aircraft shuddered on the edge of a stall. Mitchell seized the opportunity, pulling lead and triggering a short burst. Tracers walked across the 109's fuselage, stitching a line of destruction from tail to cockpit. The German aircraft rolled inverted and began spiraling earthward, trailing smoke. Mitchell pulled up and circled, watching for a parachute. After several seconds, a white canopy blossomed beneath the falling aircraft. The German pilot had survived. Mitchell felt no particular satisfaction at the victory, only a weary acknowledgement that he had once again demonstrated the superiority that made Luftwaffe High Command order their pilots to avoid such encounters. The return flight to base was uneventful. Mitchell landed with minimal fuel remaining, the gauge showing less than 50 gallons in his tanks. The ground crew swarmed his aircraft, examining the battle damage and beginning immediate repairs. The crew chief, a veteran sergeant from Tennessee named Williams, shook his head at the holes in the wing, but assured Mitchell the Mustang would be ready for the next mission. That evening, Barnes provided an updated intelligence briefing. German fighter strength was declining rapidly, not just from combat losses, but from fuel shortages and production difficulties. The standing order to avoid P-51s had evolved into a broader directive to conserve aircraft and experienced pilots for increasingly desperate defensive missions. The Luftwaffe was dying, starved of resources and overwhelmed by Allied numerical superiority. Mitchell wrote another letter home that night, describing the mission in carefully censored terms. He told his mother about the countryside he had seen, about the arrival of spring weather, about the friends he had made. He did not mention the tank column he had destroyed or the German pilot he had shot down. Some things could not be explained to people who had never experienced combat, and he saw no purpose in burdening his mother with such details. March brought better weather and an increased operational tempo. Mitchell flew almost daily, sometimes multiple missions in a single day. The routine became numbing: briefing, takeoff, combat, landing, debriefing, rest, repeat. Hayes remained his constant companion, the two of them developing an almost telepathic understanding in the air. They saved each other's lives so many times that neither kept count anymore. The squadron lost pilots with brutal regularity, Peterson was shot down over Hamburg, his aircraft hit by anti-aircraft fire that severed a fuel line. He managed to bail out but was captured and spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. Rodriguez crashed on landing after a mission, his aircraft suffering structural failure from battle damage. He survived with serious injuries and was evacuated to a hospital in England. New pilots arrived to replace them, young men with fresh faces and confident smiles that would gradually erode under the stress of combat. In April, Mitchell was promoted to captain and given command of a flight. The additional responsibility weighed on him, transforming each mission from a personal test of survival into a broader obligation to bring his pilots home alive. He studied tactics obsessively, reading after-action reports from other squadrons, discussing strategies with experienced pilots, seeking any advantage that might improve his flight's chances. The strategic situation evolved rapidly as Allied ground forces advanced deeper into Germany. Airfields were overrun, forcing the Luftwaffe to operate from increasingly distant bases. German pilots faced impossible odds, flying obsolete aircraft with minimal fuel against overwhelming numbers of superior Allied fighters. The standing order to avoid P-51s became increasingly academic, as avoiding combat altogether became the primary survival strategy. Mitchell encountered German jets on several occasions, sleek Messerschmitt 262s that possessed speed advantages making interception difficult. But the jets suffered from limited endurance and mechanical unreliability, and their pilots often lacked adequate training. Mitchell learned to exploit these weaknesses, positioning himself to attack during takeoff or landing when the jets were most vulnerable. He shot down two 262s using these tactics, adding to his growing victory tally. The victories brought him no joy. Each kill represented another human being falling from the sky, another family receiving devastating news, another life cut short by the machinery of war. He thought about the German pilot he had watched parachute to safety months earlier, and wondered whether that man had survived the intervening time. War reduced people to statistics, but Mitchell struggled against that dehumanization, trying to remember that each enemy aircraft contained a person with hopes and fears not so different from his own. Hayes noticed his friends growing melancholy and addressed it one evening as they sat outside their tent, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and red. He spoke about purpose, about the necessity of their mission, about the evil they were fighting against. Mitchell listened without responding, knowing that Hayes meant well, but finding little comfort in such rationalizations. The abstract concepts of good and evil seemed distant and theoretical compared to the concrete reality of men dying violently thousands of feet above the earth. In early May, news of Germany's imminent surrender spread through the base. Missions continued, but their character changed. German resistance collapsed in many areas, though pockets of fanatical defenders fought on with desperate intensity. Mitchell flew patrols over occupied territory, watching columns of refugees streaming westward, hoping to surrender to American or British forces rather than Soviet troops advancing from the east. The final mission came on May 7th. Mitchell led his flight on a sweep over southern Germany, encountering no enemy aircraft. The landscape below showed the comprehensive destruction wrought by years of strategic bombing, cities reduced to rubble, factories burned out, transportation networks shattered. He thought about the millions of lives affected by the war, the immeasurable suffering inflicted on soldiers and civilians alike. When confirmation of Germany's surrender came the following day, the base erupted in celebration. Men who had lived under constant stress for months or years suddenly found themselves released from that burden. They drank and sang and embraced, their relief palpable and profound. Mitchell joined the celebration, but found himself unable to fully embrace the joy around him. Too many friends had died for him to feel unambiguous happiness at the war's end. Hayes found him sitting alone near his Mustang, the aircraft that had carried him through countless missions and brought him home each time. His friends sat beside him without speaking, understanding that some moments required silence rather than words. They watched the celebration from a distance, two survivors processing the end of an ordeal that had defined their young lives. In the weeks that followed, Mitchell learned more about the German directive to avoid P-51s. Intelligence reports revealed that Luftwaffe High Command had recognized the Mustang's superiority as early as late 1943, when the type first appeared in significant numbers over Europe. The combination of long-range, high speed, excellent maneuverability and heavy firepower made it a deadly opponent in skilled hands. German losses in encounters with Mustangs had proven unsustainable, leading to the standing order that Mitchell and his fellow pilots had observed throughout their combat tours. The order represented a tacit admission of defeat in the air war. By conceding control of the skies to the P-51 and its pilots, the Luftwaffe had enabled the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German industrial capacity and hastened the war's end. Mitchell understood that his role in this outcome had been small but meaningful. Each mission he flew, each bomber formation he protected, each German fighter he engaged had contributed incrementally to the final result. He returned to the United States in June, sailing across the Atlantic on a transport ship crowded with other servicemen heading home. The voyage provided time for reflection, for processing experiences that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He thought about the men he had served with, both those who survived and those who did not. He thought about the German pilots he had fought, recognizing their skill and courage even while opposing them. He thought about the future, uncertain and open in ways that wartime existence had never been. His mother met him at the train station in Ohio, her face lined with worry and relief. She held him tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mitchell stood stiffly at first, unaccustomed to such displays of emotion after years of enforced stoicism. Then something inside him broke, and he returned her embrace, allowing himself to feel the grief and exhaustion he had suppressed for so long. The days that followed were strange and disorienting. Civilian life operated according to rhythms and priorities that seemed alien after military service. People worried about trivial matters, complained about minor inconveniences, lived without the constant awareness of mortality that had defined his existence for years. Mitchell struggled to relate to their concerns, finding himself isolated by experiences they could not understand. He reconnected with Hayes, who had returned to his home in California. They corresponded regularly, their letters touching on shared memories and the difficulties of readjustment. Hayes suggested that only those who had experienced combat could truly understand what they had been through, and Mitchell recognized the truth in this observation. A bond had been forged in the crucible of war that would endure for the rest of their lives. Mitchell eventually found work as a flight instructor at a small airport near his hometown. Teaching young pilots the fundamentals of aviation provided a sense of purpose and allowed him to remain connected to the sky that had been his domain during the war. He flew whenever possible, finding peace in the solitude of flight that eluded him on the ground. Years passed, and the war gradually receded into history. Mitchell married, raised children, built a life that bore little surface resemblance to his wartime service. But the memories remained, vivid and sharp, accessible whenever he chose to recall them. He thought often about the standing order that had kept German fighters away from his Mustang, recognizing it as a tribute to the aircraft's capabilities and the skill of the men who flew it. The P-51 Mustang had earned its fearsome reputation through the cumulative efforts of thousands of pilots who had flown it in combat. Mitchell had been one small part of that story, his individual contributions merging with those of his fellow aviators to create a legend that would endure long after the war ended. The German order to avoid combat with the Mustang represented recognition of something fundamental, that sometimes, in war as in life, discretion proved the better part of valor, and that acknowledging superior force was not cowardice, but wisdom. Mitchell lived into his 80s, eventually passing peacefully surrounded by family who knew only fragments of his wartime experiences. His children found his medals and decorations stored in a box in the attic, preserved but rarely displayed. They learned about his service in the Pacific Theater, about missions flown and friends lost, about a young man who had gone to war and returned changed in ways both visible and hidden. Among his papers, they discovered a photograph of a P-51 Mustang, its polished aluminum skin gleaming in the sunlight. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "The machine that made them afraid." No further explanation was provided, and none was needed. The image spoke to something central about his experience, about the intersection of human skill and mechanical capability that had defined a crucial period of his life. The story of the P-51 Mustang and the German order to avoid it represents more than military history. It illustrates how technological superiority, combined with well-trained personnel, can achieve decisive advantages in conflict. It demonstrates that reputation and psychological factors play crucial roles in warfare, sometimes preventing battles through deterrence rather than winning them through combat. And it reminds us that individual experiences, like Mitchell's, aggregate into larger historical narratives that shape our understanding of pivotal events. The Mustang pilots of World War II flew a machine that gave them advantages their enemies could not match. Range allowed them to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Speed let them choose when to engage and when to withdraw. Maneuverability enabled them to outfly opponents in close combat. Firepower gave them the tools to destroy targets quickly and decisively. Together, these attributes created an aircraft so formidable that an enemy air force, itself composed of skilled and experienced pilots, chose avoidance over confrontation. Mitchell understood this intellectually, but his emotional relationship with his aircraft went deeper than tactical analysis. The Mustang had been his partner, his protector, his means of survival in an environment that killed with casual efficiency. He had trusted it completely, and it had never betrayed that trust. The bond between pilot and machine, forged through shared danger and mutual dependence, proved as significant as any human relationship in his life. In his final years, Mitchell occasionally visited air shows where restored P-51s performed for crowds who knew the aircraft only as historical artifacts. He watched them fly with mixed emotions, glad that the type's legacy endured but aware that spectators could never fully appreciate what those machines had meant to the men who flew them in combat. The roar of the Merlin engine stirred memories both precious and painful, evoking a time when every flight might be his last, but when life possessed an intensity and purpose that peacetime existence could never match. The German order to steer clear of P-51s represented a turning point in the air war over Europe. By conceding superiority to the Mustang and its pilots, the Luftwaffe acknowledged a reality it could not change through courage or determination alone. Superior technology, adequate resources, and well-trained personnel proved decisive advantages that ultimately determined the conflict's outcome. Mitchell and pilots like him were the instruments through which these advantages were expressed, human beings operating at the intersection of skill, courage, and capability. His legacy, like that of thousands of other fighter pilots, rests not in individual victories or dramatic exploits, but in the cumulative effect of consistent, professional performance under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Each mission flown successfully, each bomber formation protected, each enemy fighter avoided or defeated contributed to the larger outcome. The war was won by such incremental efforts, repeated day after day by men who understood the stakes and accepted the risks. Mitchell would have been uncomfortable with hagiography or excessive praise. He saw himself as an ordinary person placed in extraordinary circumstances, doing what was required because the alternative was unthinkable. The real heroes, in his mind, were those who had not returned, whose potential remained forever unrealized, whose families carried the burden of their loss for decades after the fighting ended. Yet history remembers pilots like Mitchell because they embodied qualities worth celebrating: courage tempered by caution, aggression balanced by judgment, skill honed through dedication and practice. They flew a machine that made enemies afraid, not through terror or cruelty, but through demonstrated capability and effectiveness. The P-51 Mustang earned its reputation honestly, and the men who flew it added their own chapters to a story that continues to resonate generations later. The standing order from German High Command serves as historical footnote and metaphor simultaneously. It confirms the technical and tactical superiority of the Mustang in combat conditions, but it also illustrates broader truths about competition, adaptation, and the recognition of superior force. Sometimes the wisest course is avoidance rather than confrontation, preservation rather than sacrifice, acknowledgement of reality rather than futile resistance. One particular mission in late March demonstrated the psychological impact of the German directive more clearly than any intelligence report could. Mitchell's flight was assigned to escort a formation of bombers targeting synthetic oil facilities near Leipzig. The weather forecast predicted broken clouds at medium altitude with good visibility above 15,000 feet. Hayes flew his usual position as wingman, while two replacement pilots named Thompson and Garcia filled out the four-ship formation. The bombers assembled over England in the pre-dawn darkness, their navigation lights creating constellations against the black sky. Mitchell led his flight to the rendezvous point, arriving precisely on schedule. The bomber crews waved from their positions, recognizing the distinctive silhouette of the Mustangs. These men understood that their survival depended heavily on the fighter escorts, and they expressed their gratitude through simple gestures that transcended the limitations of radio communication. The formation crossed the channel at 12,000 feet, climbing steadily as they approached the continental coastline. German radar stations undoubtedly tracked their progress, feeding information to fighter control centers that would vector interceptors toward the incoming raid. Mitchell scanned the sky continuously, knowing that attacks often came from unexpected directions. The sun rose behind them, painting the clouds below in shades of pink and gold that seemed incongruous with the deadly purpose of their mission. Over Belgium, the first German fighters appeared. Mitchell counted at least 20 contacts, a mix of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s climbing aggressively toward the bomber stream. The enemy formation showed good discipline, maintaining cohesion as they positioned themselves for a coordinated attack. Mitchell alerted the bomber leader and prepared to engage, his pulse quickening with the familiar rush of pre-combat adrenaline. The German fighters approached to within 3 miles, close enough that Mitchell could distinguish individual aircraft characteristics. Then the lead section broke away, turning sharply to the south. The other sections followed, their formation dissolving as pilots abandoned the intercept. Mitchell watched in amazement as the entire German force withdrew without firing a shot. Hayes confirmed what they were both seeing, his voice reflecting similar disbelief. Thompson, the newer pilot, asked over the radio whether they should pursue. Mitchell considered the question carefully. The tactical situation favored letting the Germans go. His primary responsibility remained protecting the bombers, and chasing after enemy fighters would leave the heavies vulnerable to other threats. He ordered the flight to maintain position, continuing the escort mission as briefed. But the incident troubled him. 20 fighters represented a significant force, one capable of inflicting serious damage on the bomber formation. Their withdrawal upon identifying the Mustang escorts demonstrated that the German directive was being followed, even when it meant abandoning tactically advantageous positions. The Luftwaffe was conceding the initiative, choosing preservation over aggression in ways that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The bombers reached their target and executed their attack runs through intense anti-aircraft fire. Black bursts of flak filled the sky, each explosion representing thousands of metal fragments capable of shredding aircraft and killing crews. Mitchell watched as one B-17 took a direct hit, its right wing separating from the fuselage in a catastrophic structural failure. The bomber rolled inverted and began spiraling earthward, trailing flame and debris. He counted only 3 parachutes before the wreckage disappeared into the clouds below. The return flight proved uneventful. No German fighters attempted interception, despite multiple opportunities to engage. The surviving bombers limped home, many showing extensive battle damage from the anti-aircraft fire. Mitchell's Mustang had accumulated only minor damage, a few small holes in the tail section that the crew chief could repair quickly. He filed his after-action report, noting the German withdrawal and its tactical implications. That evening, Barnes convened a special briefing session focused specifically on the evolving German fighter tactics. He presented data showing a dramatic decline in Luftwaffe interception rates when P-51s were present in strength. The statistics were striking. Encounters with Mustang escorts resulted in German withdrawal over 70% of the time, compared to less than 20% when other fighter types provided escort. The implication was clear and undeniable. The P-51 had achieved a psychological dominance that extended beyond its technical capabilities. Barnes explained that captured German pilots confirmed the standing orders in interrogations. They described the directive in various terms, some calling it prudent conservation of resources, others characterizing it as defeatism imposed from above. Regardless of how individual pilots interpreted the order, compliance appeared nearly universal. Luftwaffe discipline remained strong enough that pilots followed directives even when their warrior instincts urged engagement. Mitchell listened to these explanations with mixed feelings. Professional pride in his aircraft and his squadron's effectiveness competed with a growing awareness that the air war was entering its final phase. The German withdrawal pattern suggested an enemy conserving strength for a last, desperate stand, husbanding resources that were inadequate regardless of how carefully they were managed. The Luftwaffe was dying, and everyone involved recognized this reality, even if they could not openly acknowledge it. The operational tempo increased as April brought better weather and longer daylight hours. Mitchell flew multiple missions daily, sometimes logging 6 or 7 hours in the cockpit. The physical and mental exhaustion accumulated relentlessly. His hands developed permanent tremors from gripping the control stick during high-G maneuvers. His eyes ached from constant scanning of vast empty spaces where threats might materialize at any moment. His sleep became fragmented and troubled, filled with dreams that replayed combat encounters with slight variations that always ended in his death. Hayes showed similar signs of strain. The two friends discussed their fatigue during quiet moments, acknowledging the toll that sustained combat operations exacted. They talked about the statistical reality that every mission increased their chances of being killed or wounded. Probability was an enemy as implacable as German fighters or anti-aircraft fire, one that could not be outflown or outfought. Their survival thus far represented good fortune as much as skill, and they both understood that fortune was a finite resource. New pilots continued arriving to replace casualties. Mitchell tried to pass along the lessons he had learned, the hard-won knowledge that might keep these young men alive long enough to develop their own expertise. He taught them how to scan the sky effectively, how to manage their aircraft's energy in combat, how to recognize the telltale signs that distinguished veteran German pilots from inexperienced ones. Some listened and learned, others died before the lessons could take root. Thompson proved to be an exceptional pilot, possessing natural abilities that reminded Mitchell of Hayes. The young lieutenant from Oregon absorbed instruction eagerly, asking intelligent questions and applying feedback immediately. Mitchell took him on as a permanent wingman, creating a second element within the flight that mirrored the partnership he shared with Hayes. The four-ship formation developed a cohesion that made them significantly more effective than the sum of their individual capabilities. In mid-April, Mitchell's flight was assigned a fighter sweep over northern Germany. The mission parameters were simple: fly to a specified area, engage any enemy aircraft encountered, and return to base. No bomber escort duties complicated the tactical situation. They would be free to hunt German fighters on their own terms, a rare opportunity that Mitchell approached with careful planning. The flight took off at dawn, climbing rapidly to 28,000 feet. The altitude provided a tactical advantage, allowing them to dive on any target spotted below while maintaining energy superiority. The morning air was crystal clear, visibility extending to the horizon in all directions. Mitchell could see the patchwork of fields and forests stretching across the landscape, the rivers reflecting sunlight like silver threads woven through green fabric. They flew toward Berlin, knowing that German fighters would likely be concentrated around the capital's approaches. Intelligence suggested that the Luftwaffe was prioritizing defense of strategic targets, accepting losses in peripheral areas to conserve strength where it mattered most. Mitchell hoped to exploit this concentration, catching German fighters as they took off or landed at their bases around the city. Hayes spotted the first contacts 20 miles from Berlin. A formation of perhaps 15 aircraft was climbing from an airfield east of the city, their contrails marking their ascent. Mitchell identified them as Focke-Wulf 190s, formidable opponents under any circumstances. He positioned his flight up sun, using the blinding glare to conceal their approach until the last possible moment. The German formation maintained its climb, apparently unaware of the Mustangs above them. Mitchell waited until they reached optimal attack position, then rolled into a diving attack that built speed quickly. The airspeed indicator passed 400 miles per hour as they plummeted toward the unsuspecting enemy fighters. Hayes stayed in perfect formation, his Mustang positioned to cover Mitchell's attack and engage targets of opportunity. At 2,000 feet separation, the German leader spotted them. His formation broke apart instantly, individual pilots scattering in all directions as they attempted to evade the incoming attack. Mitchell selected a target and tracked it through a series of evasive maneuvers. The German pilot was skilled, using terrain and clouds effectively while varying his flight path unpredictably. But the Mustang's superior speed allowed Mitchell to maintain position, waiting for the moment when his opponent would make an inevitable mistake. The Focke-Wulf pulled into a climbing turn that bled energy too rapidly. Mitchell adjusted his aim and fired a 2-second burst. Tracers converged on the enemy aircraft, striking the engine cowling and cockpit area. The 190 shuddered and rolled inverted, diving toward the ground trailing smoke. Mitchell did not follow, instead pulling up to regain altitude and position for another engagement. The sky had erupted into a swirling melee, individual combat scattered across several cubic miles of airspace. Thompson engaged a 190 in a turning fight, the two aircraft spiraling downward in a deadly dance. Hayes pursued another target toward the deck, his guns blazing as he scored hits on the fleeing German. Garcia struggled with an opponent who had gained advantage, forcing the Mustang into increasingly desperate defensive maneuvers. Mitchell dove to assist Garcia, coming in behind the German fighter at high speed. His sudden appearance forced the enemy pilot to break off his attack, sacrificing his advantage to defend against the new threat. Garcia escaped and climbed away, his aircraft showing damage but remaining airworthy. The German pilot attempted to extend out of the fight, diving toward the ground at maximum speed. Mitchell followed, closing the gap steadily despite the 190's impressive performance in a dive. At 500 feet altitude, the German pilot pulled up sharply, attempting a reversal that would bring his guns to bear on Mitchell's aircraft. But Mitchell had anticipated this maneuver and was already responding, pulling hard enough that grey edges appeared in his peripheral vision as G-forces compressed his blood supply. His gun sight tracked across the enemy aircraft, and he pressed the trigger as the Pipper aligned with his target. The burst was perfectly aimed. Shells tore through the Fokker-Wulf's fuselage, severing control cables and rupturing fuel tanks. The aircraft nosed over and impacted the ground at high speed, erupting in a ball of flame that sent black smoke boiling skyward. Mitchell pulled up hard, clearing the explosion by mere hundreds of feet. His entire body shook from adrenaline and the physical demands of the combat maneuvering. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes from first contact to final victory. When Mitchell reformed his flight, he found Thompson and Hayes intact, each having scored victories of their own. Garcia's aircraft showed battle damage but remained flyable. The German formation had been decimated, with at least 8 aircraft destroyed and others damaged. The survivors had fled in all directions, abandoning any attempt at organized resistance. The flight returned to base, Mitchell's hands still trembling slightly on the control stick. The crew chief examined his aircraft and found minimal damage, just a few small caliber holes in the wings from defensive fire. Williams congratulated him on the victories, but noted that the Mustang's ammunition load was nearly exhausted. Mitchell had fired over 1,500 rounds during the engagement, testament to the intensity of the combat. The debriefing session stretched for over an hour as intelligence officers extracted every detail about the engagement. They wanted to know aircraft types, markings, pilot tactics, everything that might provide insight into current Luftwaffe capabilities and doctrine. Mitchell described the fight methodically, suppressing his emotions to deliver factual information. The intelligence officers seemed particularly interested in the fact that the German formation had not immediately withdrawn upon identifying the Mustangs, suggesting that the standing directive might be evolving or being selectively ignored. Barnes proposed that desperation was beginning to override caution among some Luftwaffe units. With Allied forces advancing rapidly on multiple fronts and German cities being systematically destroyed, pilots might be choosing to fight regardless of odds or orders. The psychology of soldiers in desperate circumstances often led to unpredictable behavior, oscillating between fatalism and reckless aggression. Mitchell would need to remain alert to this possibility, never assuming that German fighters would automatically withdraw when confronted. The war entered its final weeks with a surreal quality. Everyone knew the end was approaching, yet combat continued with undiminished intensity in some areas. Mitchell flew missions over devastated cities where resistance had collapsed entirely and over pockets where German forces fought with fanatical determination. The randomness of it all disturbed him. Geography and the arbitrary decisions of commanders determined whether he encountered intense opposition or flew unopposed through empty skies. He witnessed the liberation of concentration camps from the air, seeing the rail lines and facilities that had been used for purposes too horrific for him to fully comprehend at the time. The skeletal figures visible in some compounds, the mass graves being excavated, the sheer scale of the atrocities committed provided context for the war he had been fighting. Whatever doubts he harbored about the necessity or morality of strategic bombing evaporated when confronted with evidence of systematic genocide. Hayes struggled even more with these discoveries. He had maintained a philosophical distance from the war's political dimensions, viewing combat as a technical challenge rather than a moral crusade. The camps shattered that detachment, forcing him to confront the reality of what they had been fighting against. He became grimmer, more focused, determined to contribute everything possible to ensuring final victory. Mitchell's final combat mission occurred on May 6th, the day before Germany's surrender. He led a patrol over Bavaria, where rumors suggested that German forces might attempt to establish a redoubt for continued resistance. The patrol found nothing but refugees and surrendering troops. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Those aircraft that remained were hidden or grounded, their pilots either captured, killed, or in the process of surrendering. He flew low over roads clogged with German soldiers walking westward, their weapons discarded, their war over. These men looked up at his Mustang with expressions ranging from relief to exhaustion to blank resignation. They were defeated utterly, their military destroyed, their country occupied, their future uncertain. Mitchell felt no triumph at their condition, only a weary recognition that this outcome had been inevitable once the industrial and numerical superiority of the Allies became fully engaged. The squadron held a celebration that night, though the mood was more subdued than Mitchell had expected. Too many empty chairs reminded them of friends who had not survived to see this day. They drank toasts to the fallen, speaking names that would fade from memory as years passed, but which held profound significance in that moment. Mitchell raised his glass with the others, honoring men who had flown Mustangs into combat and never returned. Barnes provided a final briefing the next morning, confirming Germany's unconditional surrender. The room erupted in cheers, though Mitchell noticed that the loudest celebrations came from men who had arrived most recently. The veterans like Hayes and himself expressed their relief more quietly, processing the end of a chapter that had consumed years of their lives and fundamentally altered who they were. The weeks following the surrender passed in a strange limbo. The squadron remained in Europe, but flew no combat missions. Instead, they conducted patrols over displaced persons camps and assisted with reconnaissance of areas where German forces were surrendering. Mitchell used the time to process his experiences, writing long letters to his mother that attempted to explain what he had lived through without burdening her with the most disturbing details. He visited some of the airfields his squadron had attacked during the final months of the war, walking through the ruins of hangars and operations buildings, seeing the burned-out hulks of German aircraft, brought home the comprehensive nature of Allied victory. The Luftwaffe had been systematically destroyed, its infrastructure obliterated, its personnel killed or captured. The standing order to avoid P-51s had merely delayed the inevitable, buying time that ultimately proved worthless. Mitchell thought about the German pilots who had followed those orders, wondering how many had survived because they chose evasion over combat. The directive had probably saved lives on both sides, preventing engagements that would have resulted in casualties without affecting the war's outcome. In that sense, the German High Command's decision represented a rare moment of rationality in an otherwise irrational conflict, an acknowledgement that some fights were not worth fighting. He also reflected on his own survival. Statistically, he should have been killed or seriously wounded given the number of missions he had flown and the intensity of the combat he had experienced. That he emerged physically intact represented fortune that he could not explain or justify. Better pilots had died. More careful pilots had died. The randomness of survival in combat defied any attempt to impose meaning or pattern upon it. Hayes articulated similar thoughts during one of their final conversations in Europe. The two friends sat outside their tent, watching aircraft take off and land from the nearby runway. They talked about what they would do when they returned home, about the futures they would attempt to build, about the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. Neither expressed confidence that the transition would be easy, but both committed to supporting each other through whatever difficulties lay ahead. The day came when Mitchell climbed into a Mustang for the last time as a combat pilot. The aircraft was being ferried back to England for eventual return to the United States. He performed his pre-flight inspection with particular care, running his hands over the aluminum skin that had protected him through so many missions. The crew chief had painted his victory markings on the fuselage, small symbols representing aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. Mitchell counted them, remembering the circumstances of each engagement. The flight to England was smooth and uneventful. Mitchell flew at medium altitude, enjoying the simple pleasure of flying without the constant vigilance that combat required. The Mustang responded to his inputs with the familiar precision that had made it such an effective fighting machine. He thought about all the pilots who had flown this type, about the collective achievement they represented, about the reputation they had earned. Landing at the English base felt anticlimactic. Ground crew took charge of the aircraft, beginning the process of preparing it for shipment. Mitchell gathered his personal belongings and checked into temporary quarters, awaiting orders that would eventually send him home. The base was crowded with servicemen in similar circumstances, all waiting for the bureaucratic machinery to process them back into civilian life. He spent his final weeks in England, visiting London and other cities, seeing the damage inflicted by German bombs earlier in the war. The resilience of the British people impressed him deeply. They had endured years of bombardment and privation, yet maintained their determination and dignity throughout. Walking through neighborhoods where entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, seeing children playing in the ruins, reminded him that the war's costs extended far beyond military casualties. Mitchell returned to the United States in late June, sailing aboard a transport ship that seemed impossibly crowded after the relative solitude of flying fighters. The voyage provided time for reflection and anticipation. He wondered whether he would be able to resume the life he had left behind, or whether his experiences had changed him too fundamentally for such simple continuity. The uncertainty troubled him, but he recognized that every returning serviceman faced similar questions. His mother met him at the train station, and her embrace communicated everything that words could not. She had aged visibly during his absence, the worry and stress leaving marks that would never fully fade. Mitchell held her gently, aware of her fragility in ways he had not been before the war. They rode home in relative silence, both understanding that some gulfs could not be bridged through conversation alone. The town where he had grown up seemed smaller and less significant than he remembered. The concerns that occupied his neighbors, the routines that structured their days, the priorities that drove their decisions all seemed distant from the realities he had experienced. Mitchell struggled to relate to people who had not shared his ordeal, finding that the gap between combatants and civilians was wider than any physical distance. He reconnected with Hayes through letters and occasional phone calls. His friend was experiencing similar difficulties in California, finding civilian life both boring and overwhelming in different ways. They discussed the possibility of remaining in the military, using their skills and experience in peacetime service, but both ultimately decided against this option, recognizing that they needed to attempt rebuilding lives that were not defined entirely by their wartime service. Mitchell found work as a flight instructor, teaching young pilots the fundamentals of aviation. The job provided purpose and kept him connected to flying, though he quickly discovered that teaching in peacetime lacked the intensity that had characterized his combat experience. His students were enthusiastic and capable, but they could not understand what it meant to fly when every sortie might end in death. He did not begrudge them this innocence, but the gap in understanding remained. Years accumulated slowly. Mitchell married a local woman who had known him before the war and accepted the changes it had wrought in him without demanding explanations he could not provide. They raised 3 children, built a comfortable life, participated in their community in ways that seemed normal and appropriate. On the surface, Mitchell's post-war existence appeared successful and well-adjusted. But the memories remained, vivid and intrusive. Certain sounds would trigger flashbacks to combat, the backfire of a car engine becoming the stutter of machine gun fire, thunder transforming into anti-aircraft bursts. He would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, his heart racing, his body prepared for threats that no longer existed. His wife learned to comfort him during these episodes, her presence gradually anchoring him back to the present. Mitchell rarely spoke about his combat experiences, even when directly asked. The memories belonged to a part of himself that he kept carefully separated from his civilian life. Only with other veterans could he discuss certain topics, and even then, only in carefully circumscribed ways. The full emotional weight of his wartime service remained largely private, a burden he carried alone, because sharing it seemed impossible. He followed news about aviation development with particular interest. The jet age dawned, bringing speeds and capabilities that made his beloved Mustang seem antiquated. He read about the Korean War, where P-51 saw combat again before being retired in favor of jets. Each generation of aircraft surpassed its predecessor, a technological progression that seemed unstoppable. Yet Mitchell maintained his affection for the Mustang, recognizing it as the pinnacle of piston-engine fighter design. Occasionally, he encountered other P-51 pilots at air shows or veterans gatherings. These meetings provided opportunities to share memories with people who truly understood. They would discuss specific missions, particular aircraft, individual pilots they had known. The conversations served as informal therapy, allowing them to process experiences that remained incomprehensible to outsiders. Mitchell treasured these connections, recognizing them as links to a crucial period of his life. As decades passed, the number of surviving P-51 pilots dwindled steadily. Mitchell attended funerals for men who had been young and vital during the war, but who aged and died like everyone else. Each death diminished the collective memory of what they had accomplished, removing first-hand witnesses to events that were rapidly becoming history rather than lived experience. Mitchell felt the weight of being among the last survivors, carrying knowledge that would die with his generation.